My name is Brian Kellerman. You are here with me for our webinar on risk assessments. This webinar, because risk assessments really cover the broad range of industries, is intended to be for food and non-food businesses. Looking at the list of folks that are here now, I see a bunch of both. With that said, I am happy to discuss any specific questions related to any industry as we start to look through risk assessments in this presentation. I want to point out a couple things first. One, there is a chat function here on the side of the screen. If you use that chat function during this presentation, I will stop and I will happily answer any questions you have and address anything specifically. I really, really love that on these webinars. It's one of my favorite things about doing webinars. Secondly, and there is a separate tab up there near the chat, which is the handout section. We have 3 different handouts, one of which Phoebe, who is on the chat currently, she put together a document about risk assessments in QMSs in ISO 9001. And there are 2 templates for risk assessments. We're actually going to use one of them, the 1 page. And so we're going to go through how to use that during this webinar. And I want to make sure that everyone knows we are recording this and it will be sent to you afterwards. So as we talk about how risk assessments are filled out and some of this information, you do not need to worry. We'll be able to get you a copy of this. So with that said, welcome again, and I look forward to covering all of the various aspects of risk assessments. They are incredibly important and a very commonly missed part of quality management systems and safety programs. Risk assessments are required in some cases, but they are incredibly useful even in situations where they're not required. So we are going to cover when we need risk assessments, what do we use them for, how they're put together, what is likelihood. We're also going to use the term probability at times as a replacement for likelihood. We're going to talk about severity, how dangerous something is. We will cover a little bit of like, when does a risk become a hazard, and what does that look like as part of this, although we're going to stick mainly to risk here. And we're going to talk functionally about how the risk assessments are put together, and we're going to show you what that looks like. So hopefully this is useful to you folks and you get a good reference point from it. One of the last things we'll look at is ISO 9001, specifically for risk assessments. They have a section on that, so we'll cover that. All right, so let's jump in. Again, if you have anything you want to talk about in the chat, please let me know. So as we get started, what are we using risk assessments for? Well, we have 4 different sort of starting points for where risk assessments get used. And the first and foremost is if somebody tells you you need a risk assessment. A customer may ask for a risk assessment, a regulator may ask for a risk assessment, or if you are subscribed to an audit in the food industry, that may be a GFSI scheme. In quality management, that would probably be an ISO-based program. And we have the requirements for risk identification and assessing that risk. So that would be a reason why we have them. Separate of that, though, and this is the thing that I think folks really miss about risk assessments, is that we can do a risk assessment about any facet of the facility. So here I utilize the term gray area. We have rules that govern our industries that we're in, and most of our businesses don't match perfectly to what those requirements are. A risk assessment is used to identify, hey, this is what this is what the rule says, but our business functions a little differently. Using a risk assessment, oftentimes that is the resolution to being slightly off. So where we have facility issues, if we have a dock door that opens up directly into production, if we have a half wall in production, if we have the storage of things in a room, sometimes a risk assessment, a written statement that just says, hey, this is why we're doing this. This is how dangerous it is or not dangerous. And this is how we're monitoring it, is what folks are going to be looking for. So that is another area. Focusing on gray area. Um, the other two that we have are a little more straightforward. Um, Number three here is just sometimes you just need a statement for what's going on in operation. That does tie into that first thing where a regulator or a audit scheme may just say you need a risk assessment for these identified areas. But even in the absence of a requirement, if you just want to say, this is how we handle allergens in a facility, this is how worker safety is managed around a particularly dangerous piece of equipment, the risk assessments for any of those things are very, very helpful. And then lastly, they are the source of identifying where we have to intervene. So again, with a dangerous piece of equipment, a bandsaw, if someone gets injured, if a digit is lost, then we need a risk assessment, probably as a part of our corrective action for that in a worker safety situation. For food facilities, where we have incredibly stringent regulations around things like cleaning and sanitizing and allergen management and recall plans, any sort of unusual circumstance. So for folks that are in a food facility, if I have a call center that I utilize for customer complaints and it might be used in recalls, a risk assessment for that arrangement, which is unusual or not what is designed for recalls, would be really helpful. And that's something that you could present to an outsider to show where we have this thing that's a little unusual and this is how we're managing it. So with those basic sort of starting points, like why we would need risk assessments, let's just quickly review likelihood and severity. Again, likelihood can also be called probability. Severity sometimes gets other terms like fatality or something like that. But for me, I like likelihood, what's the frequency or the expected frequency of something happening, and severity, how dangerous is it? Um, Again, for folks that are not in the food industry, you might have something called an FMEA, a failure mode evaluation analysis. That includes usually some kind of number system that equates to likelihood and severity. For food facilities, we have hazard analyses. The hazard analyses all have risk assessments built into them. I think that many of you probably know that, but in case you're like, oh yeah, I don't really think about risk assessments all that much, you do have it in a hazard analysis. It's functionally part of it. But this would just be separate of that. When we are doing a likelihood and severity assessment as part of our risk assessment or statements of that, I want to make it clear, and this is a super important part about risk assessments. You will see them with numbers, so 1 to 25 or 1 to 10, or without numbers. And we can multiply and add things, and there's formulas. You do not have to do that. And I want to talk about the fact that when you would or wouldn't use that, you can just say that low, medium, and high are the evaluations. The picture here really kind of looks like it has a low, medium, and high. I'm going to present one in the next slide that's just low, medium, and high. I don't really like the number-based systems, and I know that there are going to be fastidious folks out there, auditors or whomever, that listen to this and are frustrated. But the number system, it's like, man, if you're going to use a number system, the person who makes it is going to be the one to determine those numbers. It really gets any subsequent person following that person who established those numbers. It's very confusing. It certainly can be very valuable from a control standpoint to say, like, I value this 3, which is low, or I'm going to change it to a 5, which is medium, and have equations to go with it and use that as a baseline for intervention. But that's not really required. Certainly, there's no rules about that. What is very important, as I put on this slide, you need to have some common sense about your risk assessment. They need to make sense. So we're going to talk about, like, hey, you just need to write this down and it serves as a living document, a statement of where things are in a given moment. If you have assessed something in a risk assessment as very dangerous and it's not, that's bad, right? Because anyone who would come and look at that from outside will then question your judgment. So saying something is dangerous when it is not is bad. Also, and much more commonly, leadership may want us to say that things are not dangerous or don't want to treat things as dangerous. And so we have risk assessments that say things are safe when they are dangerous. That's bad. when we are building one of these things, there is a common sense requirement that, hey, I have some reasons and some logic to this of why there is safety. And we're going to talk about how to write that into the document. Um, but when I'm thinking about building that argument, I have a couple of basic questions here, right? So, like, is this a common thing in the industry? If trucks crashing, if during transportation really hasn't happened in our business, we don't need to set a medium or high risk for crashing. Yes, a crash would have a high severity. We would damage the vehicle and possibly the things in it. But if we've had a very strong track record over a decade and we're not having truck crashes or rail car incidences, then we do not want to assess it as a high likely situation. And we may not need to have a risk assessment that requires some kind of intervention. In fact, we want the opposite. If we don't have accidents, we want to say this is not risky because we do not have lots of accidents. Is it conversely, or with that, whether it's an industry, have we seen this in our operation? If water leaks are occurring on a weekly basis and we want a risk assessment for pooling water on the ground, if it's happening all the time, then we should probably have a higher risk rating for this, a medium or high risk. What we do about it is going to be dependent on how dangerous that water being there is. Do we have actual known adverse outcomes? So, like, is there something bad that we know is going to happen here? That obviously factors heavily in what our reasoning and logic here is. Now, this is where I want to point out that risks become hazards when we have known adverse outcomes. If we know that something is going to cause food poisoning in the food industry, if we know that certain electrical devices are likely to cause shocks to people, then those are no longer risks. Those are hazards. Those are things that can likely be expected to cause harm. So then we're going to have hazard analyses and probably critical safety steps or critical quality steps that go in there. But for the most part, on the path towards calling something a hazard, if it is generally a circumstance that we know has caused a problem, that's going to elevate our risk assessment here. And lastly, do we have controls already in place? And this is going to be crucial. When we have a written risk assessment, we want to be looking at, like, what are we doing about it, if anything? Having a risk assessment that says we don't do anything, it better be real low risk if we're doing nothing. And here we have our first graphic to look at. And again, here, I didn't use any numbers. We could have done 1 through 9. And we could assign numerical values to this. What you have here is just horizontally is the probability or likelihood. Vertically, we have the severity, and we have a combination there of green being safe, yellow being indeterminate, and red being a very risky thing, bordering into hazard, or going into hazard here. So on this chart, yellow means I do not necessarily need to have a control, although I may have one anyways, just by the circumstance of the business. If I have automated equipment that have a check or record data, I may have a control, whether it's something that's risky or not. And in fact, if I have automated equipment that is performing a control function, that may allow me to say, hey, look, we are monitoring this anyways, and so I consider it low risk. Yellow is going to be anything that you are sitting down to write a risk assessment and you're like, I really don't know if this is risky or not. That, to me, indicates it probably should be rated as a medium for probability or medium for severity. Might be high for one or the other of severity or probability, in which case a medium would be where we would be considering putting a control point in place for it. And high, anything that you rate high, again, is probably a hazard, probably should be considered one. There almost certainly should be some kind of control mechanism in place. So that might be a physical walkthrough, that might be a monitoring record that I'm filling things out, some kind of optical sorter, metal detector, something like that, that is addressing the potential for the risk. But one way or the other, in assessing risks, this is the framework by which we're operating. You can see versions of these kind of squares that go out, like I say, up to like 1 to 25. In the military, you'll see stuff like that. And frankly, the more numeric your approach, certainly the more scientific it would be, because it's got math and it's got numbers involved, and we can certainly build up our sense of reasoning and bolster our notions by having some rigorous math involved. But at the end of the day, you present something like this along with a risk assessment, you're probably going to see the people you're presenting it to feeling good about what you're presenting to them. So let's jump right into creating a risk assessment. So I've sort of introduced briefly this notion of, hey, this is what a risk assessment is, this is why you might have it, but let's talk about it. And for the next good chunk of time, we're really going to get into like, what should a risk assessment look like? There is not a set format for risk assessment other than the use of terminology like such as likelihood and probability and terminology of severity. There really isn't a format. There just needs to be a persuasive document that is showable to other people that will agree with you. So the contours of that, when we're sitting down and thinking, all right, well, I need risk assessments. I should have one. Brian's saying I should have one. I should probably have one. Who's going to do it? Well, anyone in the facility with working knowledge of what's going on can be the source of a risk assessment. And the person who knows the most would be the most important person to at least be involved in the risk assessment process. So we're going to sit down and create a risk assessment. It really should be the people who know what's going on with the greatest amount of specification of the area under review. And it would be nice if you had a team that was sort of like related to that task that was involved in this. And that makes it better. But with that said, most of the time it's QA and QC that writes this stuff. It's probably who's on this video watching. If you can get leadership involved, great. But if the QA or QC supervisor or director or manager is the one tasked with doing this, then you do the best you can. If you can get the maintenance guy to help you do one for maintenance, that would be the best. They need to be customized to whatever the circumstance in your operation is. And this is going to be the most important piece. We're going to talk about what this looks like from a writing standpoint and a review standpoint. And we are creating I don't want to say snapshot, but we're creating a living document that as of the effective date of that document says, this is what we do. This is what the risk is. And this is how we're mitigating it. Well, because it's a living document, we have to go back to it, and we'll talk about the review process, but it's probably going to change over time if we change certain facets of our operation. So as a result of that, it's going to be customized and it's going to get changed, and it's going to speak specifically to our facility or our operation if we don't have a facility. Okay. They really should be limited. So just to give context with what we're talking about here, you could have dozens or hundreds of risk assessments, right? We could write risk assessments for everything. In the food industry, SQF famously offers up the option of risk assessing an exemption for the second half of the entire rule book. Which is always a dream of mine to create one of those. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but it would be fun to create an entire program out of just risk assessments. I think I kind of get a kick out of that kind of stuff. But regardless, we can have a huge number of risk assessments. That would probably be a bad idea, though. We don't need to have a phone book size collection of risk assessments, because at the end of the day, it's going to cease to be valuable if we're overwhelmed. If someone trying to figure out what the risk assessments are, if there are so many that it's a pain to get through it, we're probably over developing it and making it useless. So I do recommend that we have something between a few, maybe 3 risk assessments that are crucial to our operation, but we could go as high as a dozen if we needed it. April is asking a question. If you don't already have an example in your presentation, could you give an example? April, this is a great question. we are in the next slide, just a couple slides. We're going to actually go through a risk assessment, an actual example here. So I promise you, I will. We'll get to the gist of what it should look like. So before we jump into what April's asking for, and I assume what many people also want, just want to say, with those contexts, like anyone can create the risk assessment. We need some risk assessments. We don't need to be overwhelmed by them. We need to communicate them. That's crucial. This slide's about presenting and reviewing them. We're going to have actually a separate slide on reviewing the written risk assessments following the presentation of it. But in the meantime, any risk assessments should be presented to the facility manager or operational manager, the plant manager, whatever, the top management or senior management, whatever you want to call it. They should be made aware of these risk assessments. They are written statements about what we're communicating to outsiders about risk. When they are created, they are presented and approved, and they are reviewed regularly by those folks. That is the gold standard here for any risk assessments. Once we talk about how to write them, make sure they go up the chain. That is really, really important. Any outsider who wants to review these risk assessments, if they find out that the person who wrote it is the only one aware of it, you're basically going to get no credit for it. Okay, so we are now moving into the how do we write one of these things. In presentation, before we do that, or as a lead up to that, I have created here a basic map for us to look at really quickly. So I know it's got a lot of words. It's kind of a makeshift production line. And I've put arrows to like which spots in production could have a risk assessment. And I've identified that, hey, in this example, it would be low, medium, or high risk. So overhead pipes over a production line, that would be a low risk. Overhead wiring, we might need a risk assessment because it's required for an OSHA evaluation or for food safety programs. You have to have those things for exposed food. Those risk assessments could be something we need to write. A catwalk, so someone walking over a production line, you have like a mezzanine or stairs, that would be something that could use a risk assessment. A metal detector, and we're going to specifically talk about metal detectors before the hour is out. We absolutely need a risk assessment if we have any optical sorters, any metal detection. There should be a risk assessment for that. And I have a high risk example. If I have a post for food, if you have a post production ingredient or a post kill step ingredient, if you have for non-food, if you have electronic devices and you're putting in something in a box that has electronics that is post-production, is not checked through your normal QC, you could do a risk assessment for that as well. And that would be high risk if it comes after safety controls. Other areas to think about as we look at how we're going to write this thing: hazardous chemicals, clothing, compressed air, water, how trash is managed in the facility, pest control, internal auditing, if we have an internal audit program, how often we internal audit, and shipping, receiving is another area where we can have risk assessments. So to speak to April's point, and thank you for your patience, we have how to format a risk assessment. This is the section. So if you take a download of the handouts, this is the one-page template that we have provided to you. So the sections on that are what we're going to review. So April and everyone else, this is from now forward, we're going to talk about each section and delve into like, what are we writing here? So we're going to start in a risk assessment with what area is under assessment. And I refer to it as area. It could be process under assessment or condition under assessment, anything like that. But I use the term area. So to go back a step, if I'm going to do the catwalk, the area under assessment would be the catwalk and underneath the catwalk. If I'm going to do the electrical wiring, the area under assessment is the areas of operation that have electrical wiring or the pipes overhead. Now, once we've identified where in operations or where in the facility we're talking about, the next step is that frequency. Now, the frequency of the action is different than the likelihood. We have likelihood down here a little bit lower, but before we jump into likelihood and probability risk, we're talking about the frequency that this occurs. So for example, that catwalk may be used every day. The electrical wiring and piping are always there. So all the time is this risk assessment. If I have a special piece of equipment that I bring out only once a month, and I want a risk assessment for that specialty item, if it's a dangerous piece of equipment, something with rotary blades, and I roll it out into production once a month, the frequency under assessment is once a month or only when this device is out, in which case we can very effectively narrow the scope of the risk assessment that we are writing. So we have the area and we have how often does this area affect operations. Those are crucial. And when we think about an outsider looking at this document, they are now being told, this is what we have looked at. This is how often this is occurring. That's now giving an outsider, a regulator or a customer or anyone, a clue or a written statement that we have already considered whatever this is. So once this is the purpose of these risk assessments, right? To say, hey, I already thought of this. Now, the risks associated with that action. These are a statement of what could go wrong. So with a dangerous piece of equipment, it could be worker injury. If we have a special item that performs a highly technical thing like a hot glue application to a board or a circuit board or something like that, we could specify the risk could be burning someone, it could be melting other pieces of equipment, it could be damage to things. Any risk, as we are defining it, is just centering in on to go along with where are we looking at and how often is this happening. It's like, what's the problem here? And by defining those three things, that is more than half of the value of the risk assessment itself. Once we have those three categories, where, how often, and what's the problem I'm looking at, then I'm going to assess the severity and the likelihood. So this is where this money is, all right? We talked about this is where the action is, right? We talked about severity and likelihood. I need a statement of the risk level. So I can say low, medium, or high. I can use a number-based system. It would go here and it would correspond to low, medium, or high risk, very risky or not risky. And that is going to be based on then the nature of the area, the frequency, and the actual nature of the problems in combination with these last two sections, the controls in place and the outcomes. So if something is very risky and I want to give it a high risk for severity and a high risk for likelihood, but every time I engage with this part of operations, we write down what happened. We have a video camera recording it, or we have a batch record where people are writing things down that they're doing a check. That can mitigate it down to medium or low risk, right? This thing cannot go forward if this risk occurs. For something like pipes or electrical wiring, obviously we don't necessarily have a check. That would be silly for folks to be stopping and like checking the electrical wiring every day. That's not right. What we're really thinking about the risks for overhead pipes and overhead wiring is, of course, either drips or dangling, dangerous conditions. And if we've never seen those with our wiring or the pipes, then that is going to factor into how we say, is this severe or is it likely? If we have pipes that are carrying and conveying liquids or viscous substances, but those pipes are newly installed, we have no leaks, we've never had a leak, and we are doing preventive maintenance on those pipes on a regular basis, weekly or monthly, that would be low risk. And that's great. Then we shouldn't see any problems. If we have old pipes and they leak all the time, then the risk assessment for that might be that they are likely to leak, but they're leaking in a basement and, we clean it up every week and we make sure it's fine. So the severity may be low, in which case our risk assessment is, yes, we're aware that we have a leak in our pipes, but no, it's not causing a problem. And that risk assessment then lets that outsider know this is where we see this, and this is why we're taking our operational approach. The controls in place, as I just mentioned, controls are going to be either automated equipment or monitoring, manual monitoring equipment. I might have analysis or tests that are done after something so that I can assure that I'm checking to see if that has or has not happened. We can have walkthroughs for employees where they are documenting that they are checking things. For anyone who has listened to any of my previous webinars, you will know that I am a lover of the walkthrough. I cannot speak highly enough of somebody walking around and seeing what's going on. Just anybody at any time wandering around the facility and seeing what's going on, it's magical. You can really see what's going on, and you can see things that are risky or not. And if you write down that you've checked those things, they count towards a risk assessment, right? So if I'm writing down that we check it once a week and any person has walked around and checked it within that week, then we're adhering to what our risk assessment is. I mentioned already in this webinar, we're creating a statement in time from when this document was written. This is the area. This is the frequency. These are the risks. This is how I'm categorizing those risks. This is what I'm doing about it. Those things, as long as when we go back and read this statement are still up to date, then this document really is a shield. And that's the most important part of these risk assessments. They cover you. So often when folks go through an audit or a customer walkthrough or prospective customers, and they see something in operation and it makes them a little uncomfortable, if you pull out a written risk assessment, what you're showing them is, I already thought of this, so I got it covered. And you will be amazed at how often that is the solution that is being looked for. And specifically with audits, whether they be government or subscribed audits for QMSs, the auditors are asking for it, but they can't ask for a risk assessment. So you get into these wild conflicts with them where they will talk about hypotheticals and talk about, well, what if a tree falls on your building, or what if a car crashes in, or what if there's a spill somewhere, and you get stuck with these crazy conversations. And it's extremely upsetting to go in an audit or to be under an inspection and to have one of these conversations spiraling out of control. What the auditor or the investigator is really getting at is, I needed a written statement of what's going on here and what you're doing about it. And that risk assessment for free will solve that. And you will stop having those conversations in audits or inspections if you have before. The last piece of this is obviously the outcome, which is just a summary conclusion statement here based on the other sections you filled out. So at the end, you say, hey, this was the risk. This is how severe it is. These are my controls. And based on this, I have decided that this is either a risk I have to deal with on a regular basis, or this is not a risk. We don't have to monitor this. Again, because things, when you write a risk assessment, you can say either I have a risk or don't. You could have hundreds or thousands of risk assessments, right? Every part of your facility could have a written statement. Every one of those is a shield. If someone wants to ask you, have you considered this water heater tank or whatever? Well, yeah, if I have a risk assessment, then I did. If I have 500 of them, though, then it's going to be too confusing to sort through all of them. And in the end, they might not be super valuable. So I created an example here just to kind of cover through how I write them. And because it's a slide, I didn't, elaborate. For those folks who have worked with me, I tend to be I don't get paid by the word, so I tend to really lay it out and kind of be wordy in my documents, so I can go long. But here, kept it short. So the example risk assessment here, the area under assessment is the testing of circuit boards right off the line. The frequency, now this was the main issue what I was coming up with this, right? So it's like, all right, we test for food clients, you might have finished product testing that's done once a year, when you could do it every time. For electronics manufacturers, whether I'm testing the board, every single board that gets made, or every day, or less frequently, I need to have a justification for that. So if I test the board only once per week, a risk assessment should be in place, because I need to explain to an outsider why it is I'm not testing every board. So here, the risks was just that I put in was a malfunctioning board, a quality error. the severity for a malfunctioning board would be a medium risk, right? That board is, if I try to sell it and it doesn't work, or if it gets installed by a customer in a crucial piece, that would be bad. It's going to create non-conforming product. That's not good. I have set the likelihood and probability of low, and that stands to reason. I'm only checking once a week. If it, and it could be even less than, I could say I only check once a month, or we don't check boards. We're so good at this, we don't even need to check. Or I have something in place that sort of replaces doing an actual check of the boards. And here, what I was thinking of is like, if we're pulling circuit boards off of a line and taking it over to a station and actually checking the functionality of it, that takes a lot of resources. Someone has to do it, and it has to be coordinated. And so oftentimes facilities just like don't have the manpower for a QC to be doing that. And in that case, what we're going to end up with is a need to say, listen, we want to check these boards some of the time, but we can't do it all the time. I can't do every board, or I can't do it multiple times a shift. So here I set it at low. It needs to be low because I'm not doing it all the time. And the controls in place, we have a traveler, a written record that follows the circuit board through its steps. And so at each step of assembly, I'm confirming that it was made correctly. And I got status reports for each step in the process. So if I can see from my quality records that I'm checking while it's being made that it works, then I can justify like, hey, we make them and they work. I can use also this is where historical data in my outcome, like people want to know, like, am I allowed to say nothing's broken before, so it's safe? Well, in a risk assessment, yeah, that's actually a great place to put it. To say, hey, in the last 3 years, we have had 0 errors in a circuit board. So I check once a week just because that's what we've established as appropriate for our business as a mitigation strategy, but I don't need to check every day. This right here is a beautiful done risk assessment. You can put that in front of anyone to show them, hey, we thought through why we do it weekly. This isn't just some random thing. And to reference again, the kinds of arguments and fights that that people get into during audits and inspection are like, how come you're doing it once a week? And the answer is like, because that's what we do. And they're like, well, are you sure that's right? And you're like, yeah, it's good enough. But if there's no written statement, now the auditor's like, well, what if it breaks? What if you got a new employee? And now you're off to the races on these hypotheticals and these circular conversations. And when that happens, the auditor or the inspector is writing you up. They're getting ready to write you up. And they're thinking about it while they're talking to you. Am I writing this up? And so like, it doesn't really matter what the hypothetical is. It doesn't matter what your answers are. They wanted to see something in writing that they could assess. Boom. This is it. And this, put in front of the right people, allows them to write down, hey, I have a written risk assessment. It was dated as of this year. It was current. Other people in the business were aware of it. And for someone to argue with your risk assessment is going to be extremely subjective. And of course, one thing I want to add here is like, this is somewhat subjective, right? A severity or likelihood and probability in the absence of very specific information or specific events, like on these dates, these events occurred. So I am creating someone was injured 3 times in a 20-day period. If I put that in a risk assessment, that really is a definitive bit of evidence. But electrical wiring over a line isn't a problem. It's something that's pretty difficult to objectively quantify. There is a lot of subjectivity. However, if you have a written risk assessment, now the person who's assessing it, they're going to be arguing with you only about your reasoning, because you can show them in writing that ahead of time, before today, I thought about this, my team thought about it, and this is what we came up with. And if they say to you, hey, I disagree, I think this is more dangerous than you think it is, fine, then we'll update the risk assessment, right? Then I can just quickly sit down tomorrow and I'll up the risk assessment. Do you, Mr. or Mr. Auditor, Mrs. or Mr. Auditor or Inspector, do you want to tell me what exactly the risk level you think it is? That's a much better conversation than having a unpleasant back and forth, because there isn't a documented answer for what we're talking about. So just quickly again to mention, if you download the handout for the one page, that's what these sections are there, and you can get started today getting those risk assessments put out and documented. So as I mentioned previously, we need to present them to senior management. That is crucial. Top management, senior management, whatever, they need to be aware of a risk assessment. If it relates to parts of our operation that employees are interacting with, we have to train those employees. We have to tell them. Training here would be, hey, we have a risk assessment in place. We're calling this low risk, or we're calling this medium risk, and this is why. A basic example, and that would be something with anyone asking to see a risk assessment, could pull a employee or someone in operations aside and say, hey, are you aware of any risk assessments? The answer should be yes, I was told about that. And so that's crucial. Now, reviewing the risk assessment is separate from just presenting it to people. Once we have one of these risk assessments, we need to schedule a review, and it's crucial because, as I mentioned, they're changeable documents. They should be changing. Circumstances will change them. And with risk assessments, unlike our policies and procedures, unlike monitoring records, risk assessments can change quite frequently because things change in operation. So we should be going back to them regularly. And so what might change the circumstances of a risk assessment? If I add a new piece of equipment to an existing operation that has a risk assessment, I might need to go back and add some of that in there. If I have new people, if I'm starting to use temp workers instead of full-time employees, that might increase the risk because people are not working in the facility for any specific length of time, and they're not as knowledgeable about what they're doing. Any events involving the written risk assessment is going to change that risk assessment, right? So if I've written that something is not dangerous and someone gets hurt, my risk assessment is going to be changed. I'm going to identify that event, and as of the date of that event or shortly thereafter, an adjusted risk assessment is going to be a crucial piece of documentation to show outsiders like, yeah, that we are not happy with that event occurred, but I have captured it within my risk assessment. And this is now something that, hey, we added a corrective action where we added a monitoring event for this so that no more dangerous outcomes occur. So anytime we have a change that is specific to a risk assessment, we talked about a catwalk. If the catwalk is over an area that does not have exposed food on it or exposed product, any kind of exposed operation, then it might be low risk. But if I bring in a conveyor belt that is moving exposed parts or exposed food underneath it, that risk assessment is going to need to be adjusted. So like I said, the facility operations can cause the adjustment of a risk assessment and any event or new circumstance around it. If that does not happen, if we have our written risk assessment and there are no changes, we should be reviewing this every single year at a minimum. And the reason for it is because of the changeability of risk assessments. So writing them is crucial, and then having some kind of documented review of them. If you don't change the risk assessments, you can just shoot each other an email that says, as of this date, we reviewed these 5 risk assessments and we can confirm that they are not changed. That would be sufficient as a written record of review. But if you present somebody a risk assessment and it's 4 years old, that, just like having no one trained on it, just like not having presented it to senior or top management, if it's really old, even if it technically is up to date, questions are going to be asked. All right, so this was written 4 years ago. Were the people who wrote it are they still here? When's the last time you guys have talked about this? And like, what is the mechanism by which we're even looking at this? Are we looking at it? So that yearly review in the absence of changes is crucial to making sure that we have a top line approach to risk assessments. So now hopefully we're seeing a really nice big picture here of like, oh man, all right. So now we've talked about I need this risk assessment with the area, the has, the what is the risk, what's the frequency, and those other statements. I need to make sure that I've trained people on it and presented it. Once it's written, I'm going to schedule the review. And now we should be in great shape for having risk assessments in our system. And once we do, I mean, it's a movable feast for resolving anything in the facility that's been causing you heartache. The things that are making it so you're having a hard time sleeping at night when you go home from operations, like a risk assessment might be the solution to your problem, because that written statement doesn't absolve you of something going wrong, but it does show that you're aware of it and that you're considering what it is you're doing about it, if anything. And if you're not sleeping at night because you feel like you might not be doing enough about it, then obviously the answer would be to add some kind of monitoring event. And again, nothing works better than walking around and checking. Go do a walkthrough, do more of them. That will always help. If we need some kind of intervention, do that too. And with that said, I do want to quickly bring up metal detectors, optical sorters. Those are really important in our operation. And for those devices, we need a risk assessment. And I want to tell you a good story about a recent client I worked with who had a metal detector. And it will explain to you folks why it is you need a risk assessment for metal detectors. The reason is because the circumstances by which you use a metal detector are very, very wildly variant. And different facilities need them and don't need them. If you are a food supplier to Costco or other major retailers, there is no, do I need a metal detector? You have to have one. However, if you do not have a customer demanding it, it can be very confusing if I need a metal detector, or do I, or to explain why I don't have one if somebody's asking you. And a risk assessment, one way or the other, for either foreign material control or specific to a metal detector, if you have one, is crucial. So the story I have for you is the client that I worked with, we went through and they had a metal detector, but they were very upset about the metal detector because whoever bought it was gone. And there was no documented reason for buying that metal detector. And I can tell you, based on that operation, they did not need a metal detector. There was no metal on metal contact. It was absolutely obvious they didn't need a metal detector. And they had never had a finding, but they were checking the metal detector on an hourly, or I think it was once a shift basis, but like they were checking it every day. And it was a real pain for them. And some of their product needed to be metal, could be metal detected through this device. It had a big enough opening for some things, but not others. So they had one for unknown reasons, and they had never had metal. That is something that needs a risk assessment, right? These are the limits for ferrous, non-ferrous, and stainless steel. That goes into the risk assessment. I have metal and I find it regularly, or I've never found metal, you need to have a risk assessment for that. It explains to others what's going on with this device. You might have to have it. And that also goes into risk assessment, right? I bought this thing because I wanted to make a lot of money selling to this client or customer, and they said I have to have a metal detector. However, I don't actually have metal problems in this facility. That's a completely normal thing to put in a risk assessment. When I was a QA manager, we had a risk assessment, or excuse me, we had metal detectors on every line. I did not know enough back then to have risk assessments for it. But we had metal detectors for every line, and we never had metal. When the metal detector went off, it was like, what is going on around here? Why is this even occurring? We never see this. And had I had a good risk assessment, it would have been helpful. Now I make sure that everyone that works with our facility that has these, or excuse me, that works with our company, every facility that works with our company that has a metal detector gets a risk assessment for it. And I cannot recommend it enough. Same for X-ray, optical sorters, any of those devices, get a risk assessment in place. We showed you how. Download the handout and get going on putting a risk assessment in place for it. So as we go to wrap this up, I'm going to spend about 2 or 3 more minutes, more give or take, explaining some stuff. We'll have time for some questions if you have any, or any comments you want to make. I threw this up. Now, I guess I should say, for those of you who are food, folks, we actually on our website have a series on risk assessment in food facilities. My wife told me not to put it on us as a slide because this is for food and non-food. But since we're talking about it, we do have that. And it talks about GFSI specifically. So BRCGS and SQF and those things. You can see where you need risk assessments for those programs. Here, I want to talk about ISO 9001. In those other food programs, they tell you you need a risk assessment for these specific parts of operation, and they're asked for, they're required. For ISO 9001 QMSs, there is a risk section in that code. It is section 6, the planning section, and 6.1 is risks and opportunities. And they want you to have a documented sense of the risks in your operation because it's planning in that ISO 9001 context. It really is thinking through in a generic sense of what the potential risks are for operations. So what we recommend, what we do in our programs, and what I'm recommending to you, some kind of worksheet, a spreadsheet, a list of different aspects of your QMS and what the risks are. Again, here, a numbering system or just low, medium, or high risks are going to be okay in ISO 9001. They do not tell you exactly how to do it. But we recommend having a worksheet for risk. And in our programs, we do some kind of number system, but that is not necessary. You can also just use the risk assessment formats that we gave you, and you can fill those out, and those can be put into a QMS. Those definitely can and should be put into any food folks into your GFSI program or GMP or GDP program, any certification program. Definitely you're going to want to use those risk assessments. Here, if you're a non-food facility and you're doing ISO 9001, you can create some risk assessments and throw that right into your risks and opportunities section. And that will work towards demonstrating that you are assessing risk and that you have an ongoing program for that. So that takes us to the end of this brief overview. I just want to, again, reiterate the importance of these as written records. They really are what so many people are looking for. Any advanced or high-level safety or quality program should have risk assessments. And I would say for our clients, about half or more don't have any. So it is something that we felt really compelled to put on a webinar here, just as a, hey, you should really have these and you should be doing them. If you already have risk assessments, great. That is awesome. If you don't have any, welcome to the show. You should definitely start this process and you will feel a lot better. Again, a number, I would say between 3 and 10. I can't imagine any operation I've ever been in that couldn't use at least somewhere between 3 and 10 risk assessments for what's going on as a statement of where things are, unusual facets of the facility. One thing I wanted to mention, and I'm remembering now, if you have a shared facility, if you have multiple people working in a facility, like, oh yeah, a risk assessment is the crucial way to resolve that. And that comes up frequently. If you're a warehouse or you have a warehouse space and you sublease to someone else and you've been wondering, like, am I ever going to get in trouble for that? Not if you have a risk assessment. If you simply say who they are, what they're doing, how often they have stuff in there, and anything you are doing to make sure that the stuff that they have in that operation isn't affecting your stuff is now a written statement that could be presented and you will not get in any trouble. I mean, unless there's something bad going on, in which case you could. Again, when you're changing them, make sure that you go back to or when things change in the facility, make sure you go back to your written risk assessments and make sure that they're up to date. Review them every year at a minimum. That's just, you got to do it for risk assessments, and they're living documents. So once you have one, they really are things that become vibrant parts of how you come to understand your operation and how you present them to other people. They absolutely are great training documents as well. So you can double dip on that. That is what I have to say. We are at 1:55, so we're by Eastern Standard, so we're 5 minutes off the hour. Does anybody have any questions? Is there anything that I did not get to that you would like me to review? I'm going to give everyone about a minute or so to start typing it out. And if I don't see anything, then that's going to be it. In the meantime, I hope that this was valuable. I hope that you got a good sense of risk assessments, and that if you didn't have them, that you learned something new here. And I hope that this is helpful going forward. Thank you. Awesome. Everyone, enjoy the rest of your day and week. Stay safe out there. And hope to see you again for the next one.